What's going on, everybody? We are the Vanishing Mediators. I am Nick, joined today by Andrew, aka the Big Sig, whose signal may or may not be functioning at the moment. We'll see how it goes. And today we are introducing Noah. What's going on, Noah? Would you like to introduce yourself?
What's up? There's not really much to introduce. I'm just hopping in on this thing and just seeing what's going on, with this Karatani. So,
Theory fan. You're
yeah.
interested in psychoanalysis, philosophy, Marxism, that kind of thing.
Yeah, Noah's been in some of the emancipation reading groups too.
Word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's been in the game. He's just like deep cut. Awesome. So what are we talking about today, guys?
So I was just looking at your camera to make sure you're not fading out here.
Okay.
But yeah, today we will be discussing the Japanese philosopher Kojin Karatani's 2010 text, The Structure of World History from Modes of Production to Modes of Exchange. A very eclectic and interesting sort of digest of so many different historical currents and thinkers, and an attempt at a kind of like synthesis, but on an architectural level, right? That's Karatani's big idea. I haven't read that text, architecture as a metaphor, but architecture, structure. This is a big part of how Karatani approaches philosophy, history, the history of ideas, critique of political economy, and many other disciplines and fields. And he's able to very seamlessly blend together many different and disparate thinkers who you wouldn't necessarily associate, with one another. But he's able to do it in a very inventive way, I would say. And in this text, well, he is trying to think through in various configurations what the meaning of what he calls a kind of Baromean knot of capital, state, and nation is. What is it? How do these different elements, registers, to use a Lacanian term, manifest themselves? And how are they, in one form or another, always interdependent?
Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry if my signal's coming in a little choppy. We'll make it work. I'm on the phone, guys. But yeah, I think that's like a good
If you want to
segue.
just turn your camera off at some point too. Sorry to interrupt, but like if you want to turn your camera off at some point, maybe audio only from the Big Sig, it might run smoother.
Yeah. Am I coming in choppy?
I think maybe it's just your image is a little choppy.
Well, we're all recording, so yeah. Usually it smooths out on the end after you record it. But I think without like him, like Karatani himself becoming too eclectic by drawing from various thinkers from like French anthropology like Pierre Clastres, who's influential in Deleuze and Guattari, Marcel Mauss and Lévi-Strauss, amongst various Japanese anthropologists. He's also influenced by French structural theory as well, the Marxist tradition, Continental philosophy. Kant is a big one. Like, without being too eclectic, he's able to like make a point with bringing a lot of these thinkers into dialogue regarding, like the Marxist conception of freedom and Kant's like conception of like the cosmopolitan man, while also showing, like a sort of structure of history rather than like a historicism, one could say, and a history that's not necessarily linear, right? Not and he kind of like is able to like point out a transition from the so-called primitive society, which would be like the hunter-gatherer and like the sort of classic, Evo Devo science bros, to like, agricultural societies, to societies of the gift exchange, and how like we go into feudalism, etc., all that good stuff, without falling into the trap of like a teleology that conforms to like what many so-called critics of Marxism would say, evolutionary developmentism, like, oh, Stalinism, etc. I think he offers a history that's structural and also at the same time contemporaneous, because he shows how, well, sure, we don't live in feudalism, but some of these aspects of the states and hierarchies, some of these aspects from quote unquote primitive societies like gift exchange, nations and associations still persist within a Baromean knot that you pointed out of nation, state, capital. I guess to sum it up, he's, to use the term that's always exhausted, he's dialectically thinking in his own way.
Right. And it's not a straightforward sort of linear dialectic. I mean, obviously, dialectics is not supposed to be linear, but more often than not, it still lends itself to a kind of linear narrative. I mean, and to a certain extent, of course, he does explain the modes in a linear fashion for the sake of convenience, but always makes an effort to show how one mode is nested in another. And what results is a very finely grained texture that he's weaving, and the scope of it is actually kind of mind-blowing if you think about it, because one page will be talking about Lao Tzu, and then the next page we're talking about, Louis Bonaparte. It's like everybody's here. Every thinker, every historical figure, everyone makes an appearance, but
It's a who's who's cast.
Specific roles to every thinker and every historical personage in putting forth this theory he has, which is I think very unique. And yeah, like you were saying, Andrew, it is dialectical, but especially in the sense of like kind of sublation. So with
I don't.
yeah,
I was gonna say, like, in a sense, we could think of it without being eclectic ourselves. At least how I kind of see it. Because he would call like a transcendental method, which he's taking from Kant, right, as a way to kind of develop a sort of like not only philosophical but like a sort of science of history, using the Kantian transcendental method. But you could also see like analogously, he can be compared to the way someone like Alain Badiou would say like the Marxist dialectic or the materialist dialectic is different from, you could say, the idealist dialectic of Hegel, in that for Hegel, he can only think in like straight circles. That's kind of like an oxymoron. A circle, a circular fashion that's always moving in a sort of simple arrow of time, only to return back to itself. Um, and there's only like simple contradictions. Whereas for the materialist dialectic that Lenin sort of extracts, as well as Marx and Althusser, is one of periodization, right? And periodization can't be seen, even though when we like to think of history, the bourgeois notion of history is very intuitive, where it thinks in like a linear progression. Whereas in the materialist dialectic, we kind of think sort of, dare I say, retroactively. We see where there's sort of schisms and antagonisms um, within, you could say, like a topography, especially like in the Karatani sense. He's bringing in all these various thinkers that coexist in different parts of the globe, right? So he's kind of like giving his own version of like another Marxist definition, very jargony, totality, right? You know, he's given a broad spectrum of how um, history, analyzing history functions, you know, within a fidelity to Marxism and a fidelity to like the sort of materialist dialectic.
Yeah, I mean, we have like an attempt to outline historical progression, for lack of a better term, but in terms of overlaps, I would say, between these periods. And that's, to me, what this materialist dialectic is. It's kind of like these different periods. They don't necessarily just in a clean fashion like succeed one another, but are always coexisting with one another in a certain form, with one mode predominating. I think for him, it's like this idea of mode C. We'll go over the modes in a minute, but mode C, of course, is commodity exchange. Mode C is the predominant mode of our current era, has been for a few centuries now, undergone different permutations, but he's going to show how it predominates. And I think it's like, for him, a mode of exchange as opposed to mode of production, because his idea is that production is very important, but that we should move away from thinking about production and think about modes of exchange. And I think that is almost his answer to this idea of, very Althusserian, some might even say like Engelsian, the economic in the last instance. Like, what does that mean? It's
Yeah.
mysterious and highly disputed what this means. The late hour of the economic in the last instance never really arrives, but he's able to show how this economic is always present, but in opposition to a kind of vulgar Marxian understanding of like base and superstructure. He's able to create a structure of his own, which shows how it shows exactly how there's a kind of interpenetration between base and superstructure. And I think I would dare say it's more useful to think about these modes than to think about, because base and superstructure, even if it comes with the proviso of, well, base is not just what's happening behind the scenes economically, and the superstructure is just a veil of the base, when you think about and experiment with, and he's almost inviting the reader to experiment with this framework of these four modes, when you think about it in terms of modes A, B, C, and D, then you can understand better how superstructure and base are not two moments. And they aren't, they don't lend themselves to the kind of historicization that, you know, stage theorists or, you know, commit the crime of often, like, historicizing things in a teleological sense. But how about we talk about the four modes?
Yeah. I'm glad that you brought up that distinction between production and exchange, because this is something where, the I've heard, like, and again, they're not like Marxist scholars per se, but your typical, like, online leftist, like, oh, that's not Marxist. It is, this distinction between focusing on production versus exchange, because he gives an argument for it, that when you look at Marx's Capital, he doesn't start off from the line of production when he looks at the cellular level of capitalism, or capital, which is the commodity form. He looks at the commodity form through its function in exchange value and use value. Um, and it's from there that we can then see the granular level of how, not only the capitalist mode of life operates, but also the social relations that help reproduce it. Because I think you're right in pointing out, like, this, like, sort of problem within what Althusser, and it's not even Althusser, it's just like in Marxism in general, the base and superstructure dyad, because what is the base, but it's supposed to be the economic mode of production, right? Which is the forces of production and the relations of production and its unity. And superstructure is supposed to be like, like what, resides, from it, which is going to be all like social relations, the institutions, the political, et cetera, the state, all these good stuff. But Karatani says it's like, no, actually, like, mode of exchange is actually, I think he says, like, an extension uh of base, right? And it gives a better argument for that, like thinking um exchange as extension of the base, because it's not about necessarily production, but exchange and relations that sort of give rise to this mode of life, which is the main important thing, because I think when we focus so much on modes of production, um, I think it is easy to fall into the trap of economic determinism, when we're not, even though political economy is important for Marx and Marxism, the goal is not to create economic theory or economism. The goal is to understand social reproduction in forms of exchange, how these exchange modes that we're going to be talking about throughout history uh, inform and shape life.
Which, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's like what Karatani is laying the stress on here is social metabolism, or what he calls intercourse. Social metabolism um, has more to do with, well, something that some theorists have called, Marxian, like, naturalism, which I think is useful to help once and for all really puncture this notion of economism, which it's so easy to, tar Marx and Marxists with this, like, economism accusation. Um, even the most vulgar arguments against Marxism often draw upon that criticism that it's teleological and that it pushes a reductionism to the economy ultimately having the final say in everything, and acting as this sort of agent of, just a kind of logical reduction of all human volition to economic calculation. But I think if we look at these modes, we can see how exchange is a much more interesting point of departure, in that, like with mode A, for example, mode A is reciprocal exchange. Exchange is the through line with all of the modes, but mode A is reciprocal exchange. It characterizes so-called primitive cultures, clan communities, tribal communities, and it's hard to paint with a broad brush every tribal community that exists throughout the world, but there are certain conventions and practices and customs that vary, but do still typify pre-empire, pre-capitalist societies, whether it's the Maori tribes or Amerindians, the Tupi people of South America, or the people of the Trobriand Islands. Malinowski was studying their ways. And one thing that seems to emerge as a through line is gift exchange. So let's talk about the concept of the gift. I read Mauss's essay on this from 1925. Fascinating stuff. The gift, of course, is something that happens between tribes, between communities, between households, where objects are exchanged, and these objects are considered valuable and precious, not so much because of their use value, but because they represent, or I could say even directly in the minds of these people, present a kind of continuation of the social structures in existence, which can both serve as, the grounds for war and also neutralize conflict at the same time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and the reciprocity is one aspect, but also how the gift can bring about debt and plunder of another clan, because of how the nature of a gift that one clan or community can bestow can bring about an impossibility in its return. Because when we think about the gift exchange, we should also think about the debt that is owed with that. And it was quite interesting too, because you mentioned Mauss. And funny enough, did you know that Mauss is the nephew of Emil Durkheim?
Yes.
Yeah.
Who was his mentor?
One of the, yeah. I thought that was pretty cool. Magic and animism are also a big structure of these societies, and how we should think of magic and animism and fetishism or whatnot, charms and rituals as like the sort of like motor force for exchange as well. And which, like, because you pointed out, like, precious objects, sometimes even a ritual or seasonal rite, um, and initiations are in themselves forms of gifts, especially like when another tribe enters the land as a sort of like protection, right? Or a welcoming. These things um, are things that matter as well. And you also mentioned war, and like war, in a sense, helps keep stability with between two opposing tribes. They're not trying to wipe other out, but sort of in a sense make a sort of neutralization through that sort of cohesion through war, which you know counterintuitively uh not counter well, it would be counterintuitive to the sort of bourgeois historian or bourgeois anthropologist, whatnot, but this actually is what prevents what we'll see later in Karatani, the idea of the state coming about. But this is not even Karatani's analysis. This comes from, again, the French political anthropologist Pierre Clastres.
Yeah.
It's a way to kind of mitigate the power. And sometimes it's not even in like the sense of just tribes going to war. I think I used like offline the example of like if you've seen Mulan, right? The way that these like families send their sons to war during a time of famine, right? Again, this is where magic comes into play, when divination is used to predict like how is like the next century or so going to be, and they are being met with like a certain omen or a certain like catastrophe waiting to come. War comes about to help sacrifice to then bring in more abundance, right? So then you could see how magic, divination, animism are the guiding force, not only for like the war, but also to bring it back, something in exchange. Again, another pop culture example I'll bring is like Full Metal Alchemist. What did they say? The law of equivalent exchange. You must sacrifice one thing to gain one thing. That's a big thing in these gift economy societies.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. It's like what you were saying before about war being of the order of a kind of natural rhythm almost. I think definitely plays into, Levi-Strauss and his idea of alliances and kinship systems. And you would think that the nuclear family is still somehow one of the main kernels of making up these societies. But one thing that, Karatani is going to point out, I'm looking at my notes here because I've got some notes on that first chapter, is that kinship in terms of blood relations actually isn't as important as we might imagine. We're so conditioned to think in terms of the nuclear family, right? And the nuclear family represents the nucleus of society in our capitalist world. But it really has more to do with, gift exchange, that is, the composition of these clan communities and the heading off of the emergence of hierarchies. So in these chiefdom communities, the chief is not an authority. He talks about how uncertain Amerindian tribes, the chief might not even really be listened to. It's not like he commands respect in the way that a dictator would, a ruler, a king. The chief is someone who amasses wealth for the sole purpose of giving it away. So he negates his position of authority in assuming it, because his role is to give away as much wealth, to keep as much of this wealth in circulation, to level emergent hierarchies, to ensure preemptively a kind of neutralization, not of conflicts, because conflict is built right into the structure of these societies, but rather like the emergence of hierarchy. So Strauss here says, Levi-Strauss, the gift is an indeterminate value of signification. We could call it like a floating signifier. It's neither use value nor exchange value that defines the gift. It's really like I think, I don't remember
The sign, right? It's really
it's like it's a pure sign and it's magical power. And I think this is coming from Malinowski. I could be wrong. I think he's talking about the people of the Trobriand Islands, but HAU, how is this, or like mana, for example, is this animistic spirit or soul that is contained within the object. These are also the souls of ancestors, for example. And that means every object, the home itself, like first and foremost, is living. And exchange is something that is done not for purely utilitarian purposes, right? It's not to gain an advantage over your enemy necessarily, although it does leave your enemy and your friend indebted. It's like a form of debt that operates on its own, in a sense, to maintain like a social fabric. And he says there is such a thing as trade. They do have like straightforward commodity exchange in these cultures. Like, don't get it twisted. Like, I don't think any community could exist without some form of like trade on the basis of utility, because people have to eat. They need subsistence goods. And one thing Claster points out is that, it's wrong. It's a complete misconception to think about these cultures as not having a surplus and just like living and fighting tooth and nail to survive all the time. It's like, no, they have a surplus. It's just that they don't prioritize the useful over, for lack of a better term, the spiritual.
Yeah.
Everything is contained.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because you're touching on 2 points that are going to help to understand, like, not only just continuing to understand the function of mode A, but then also like how we end up in the sort of like contradiction internal to it that transition, to use that nonchalantly, into like mode B. But two things, like, one, like when we think about like the analysis of like clans, alliances, and kinships from Levi-Strauss, Karatani brings into light something that's talked about, I want to say, like within Strauss, which is like this idea of the incest taboo, right? The prohibition of incest, which is not, like in the way that psychoanalysis conceives of it in the Oedipus complex, nor is it like, a prohibition because of like, this sort of grave immortal sin. Rather, it's because like you just can't keep it within the family. We need to expand, right? So this is where like women become gift exchange to be able to create a pact. Yeah, exogamy, right?
Yeah.
Right. And you got exogamy and endogamy. And he also even points out like, you also have like this sort of patrilineal tribes and the matrilineal, but don't get it twisted. Just because there are patrilineal does not mean that implies patriarchy versus matriarchy. In fact, you could have a matrilineal orientation or organization while being patriarchal, in the same way as you could have patrilineal while also having matriarchal.
Good point.
So like he kind of he brings that up like in passing, but that's not necessarily like the point I wanted to kind of like arrive at. but that like this is how you could see that it's not just within the magic of like, engraved objects, totems or masks, precious metals, etc. But it's not just purely on like goods, but even the way that people are brought in and out, right, to create alliances and pacts that would give forth more community building and exchange. And another thing um with that is also he clears up this sort of presupposition that we tend to have, like this bias that anthropologists and archaeologists tend to have when regarding, like, let's say these primitive tribes, that if we take the earliest and most primitive tribe of the hunter and gatherer, that necessarily presupposes sedentary life, right?
Yeah.
And especially agriculture as well.
Sedentary
He
revolution.
says, yeah, the sedentary revolution comes after. In fact, most of these ancient primitive tribes were very much nomadic, right? Even something like D&G talks about the nomadic. They just kind of like metaphysicalize it, but like, there was a lot of nomadicism on the basis that because you brought about how everything has life, there is this tension between the living and the dead. When the dead are buried, you're not supposed to live on the land in which the dead are buried, because then they become resentful of the people that are living. It's just a part of, the animism and their spiritual way of life. But that begins to change within, the sedentary aspect. And I think he just simply says, why did the sedentary revolution happen? Well, a couple of reasons, but to put it simply, climate change, right? We can't just be moving around because of the certain time of period in which like the climate change happened. So because of that, the sedentary life takes place, and that also shifts the way that the afterlife is even thought about, right?
Right. Yes.
But then we also get a division of labor, which then produces inequality. So like fishing becomes big, but the idea of the reserve or the reservoir comes in, the accumulation of the surplus, which brings about a problem with exchange, right? In the gift society, as well as inequality between the men and the women, which is something that Engels points out in origins of the private property, right, in the state, or origins of the family and private property in the state. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think Engels goes so far as to pinpoint the division of labor and the demotion of women to a lower role as the origin of inequality that will one day lead to the division of labor that exists today, which is quite a bold claim, but it makes sense. And it's like the fixed settlement communities that come about. I don't want to say after, but alongside these nomadic tribes represent the beginning of what we might call a society. The interesting thing about these nomadic tribes, and they don't really fall within any of the modes exactly, is that, as you pointed out, Andrew, and I think it's such a fascinating thing to note, is that there is a sense of vendetta, right, that comes about with fixed settlement communities. With nomadic tribes, you want to get away from, you want to quit the dead as soon as you can, because you think, yeah, they don't want to be dead. They resent me for being alive. We'll bury them and move on. And it's the same thing with bonds of marriage or membership in the community. They are easily dissolved. You want to leave? Go ahead, leave. Do your own thing. You can be your own nomad. It doesn't matter. All is forgiven because you're on the move all the time. And social bonds are actually a weight, and like you're saying, with that weight comes the accumulation of goods. It comes, inequality is in the very nature of accumulation. So animism, as product of this relation of reciprocal exchange, becomes a kind of a system of relief, or like maybe almost like a kind of exhaust valve that everyone must obey in order for, well, a mode of production, to kind of run smoothly, but also to, not incur the uh, anger of the dead, to maintain a kind of a balance, but also to isolate the anima of nature. And he says magicians are actually like the first scientists in a sense, because they're not trying to extract anything useful from nature necessarily.
Right. The magicians and the sorcerers are like the proto before the priestly caste. Right.
Right.
Because it's funny that you say that, because I was thinking about like the pre-Vedics, like even though like in ancient India you have the caste system, the pre-Vedics are interesting because like karma doesn't become like how much like moral debt you did for having bad actions, and then like you have good actions, so then you reincarnate into like a better life. No, like karma had to do with like the way in which you do the right ritual and give the right offerings to appease the gods, right? To make them happy, right? Like there's a sort of like proto-science to how you operate with a magical ritual in order to gain something in return.
Yes, and the gods are nature, but the thing that magicians achieve is the isolation of nature as an it. In nomadic societies, you don't need to isolate nature as something which wants appeasement. In these fixed settlement societies, now that we're here, now that we're claiming this land as our own, now that we're all living together, some kind of appeasement must occur in order for us to avoid being completely like wiped out by the forces of nature, which are animistic forces, which are gods, and that's going to lead us to mode B, right? So mode B is what Marx called the Asiatic mode of production. Here it's a mode of exchange. It's redistribution and plunder. So what does that mean? Well, basically, a lot of this, I think, has to do with like fishing and hydraulic societies. Those are societies which form along rivers, which are able to basically sustain their community through public works projects and irrigation systems alongside rivers. What that leads to is, Sumerian civilization, Egyptian civilization, of course, the Nile, and the emergence of hierarchy. So we started this conversation talking about capital, nation, and state. Well, it's like now we see the emergence of the state with mode B. Mode B is the emergence of the state because we get a priestly class that forms, and we get a bureaucracy. The bureaucracy and the priestly class are the same. the kind of religion that the bureaucratic priestly class adhere to and maintain. They manage the rites and ceremonies involved in this religion become something like a superimposed management system on these agrarian.
I want to ask.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask when it refers to the priestly caste, like, and this is just a question, because I don't remember if he says this or not, but like with the introduction of the priestly class, is this where we kind of see the emergence of monotheism arise?
Not quite yet. No.
Okay.
That's what's interesting. You would think, okay, so it's monotheistic. Really, I think more so
Because
you get a pantheon of gods. Now we're jumping ahead.
a pantheon. Yeah, you got a pantheon.
In mode D, skipping mode C, where universal religion, he says, he talks about that. I well, remember the one pharaoh's name who worshipped the sun god and wanted to impose a
Akhenaten.
religion. Akhenaten, right? Yeah, Akhenaten wanted to be like the sun god guy, and so we should all like let's oust all of these other minor gods, and we're just going to worship the sun god. But that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. The question of religion actually isn't so much material in the details of it here, so much as the maintenance of this priestly class and a bureaucracy. And the thing about the bureaucrat here is neither warrior nor farmer. Everybody is kind of a warrior or a farmer in clan communities. One or the other, there might be a division of labor there, but this is, I think, the first class that emerges, which is neither. They don't have to farm, and they don't have to go to war. And another thing that's very interesting is that, think about Hammurabi's code, famous, eye for an eye. But Hammurabi's code is a ban on endless vendetta, because the thing about clan communities is life is extremely precarious. The endless warfare that exists, the vendettas that are like the fulcrum of society that have to be settled, but are also exacerbated by gift exchange, are now neutralized by an authority that comes from on high. And we get the emergence of the city-state. I think it says Jane, is it not Jane Jacobs? Yeah, Jane Jacobs talks about the proto-city-state. And what we get there is the village. We get skilling of people, specialization, and everything is more or less organized around these public works projects, which aren't just about sustaining the community, because now we get a constellation of different communities under the authority of one class, which is a proponent of a specific religion, like a pantheon of gods. But now trade does come to predominate, not in the sense of mode C, not yet interest-bearing capital, but trade that has to do with the maintenance and perpetuation of this priestly caste or class, and What does that depend on? Taxation, tribute. Now, tribute takes the form of, at least nominally, reciprocal exchange, although it's far from reciprocal. The world empires that emerge in, China, Sumerian civilization, Egypt, they are tribute societies which pretty much allow these individual communities, these agrarian communities, to maintain their ways of life, but now they have to pay taxes. And Andrew, I'm sure you could chime in here. What does that remind us of? Well, sovereignty. It's not sovereignty proper, but it is Hobbesian, right? So, Andrew,
Absolutely, yeah.
what Hobbes'
Yeah.
covenant consists of, right? What is Hobbes's covenant?
Well, it's like the exchange of like a certain payment in, if I recall, it's like the exchange of a certain payment via the tax. In return, you get protection, right?
Exactly.
For sovereignty. Yeah. So I kind of like jumbled that up, but for you to be the sovereign leader, especially to protect me in fear of all these other sort of institutions of associations to plunder me, to harm me, my family, my property, etc. I pay a certain tax to this sovereign leader. I give them power in exchange for protection, right? Not necessarily freedom. They are the ones that have freedom, but I have protection.
Right. And there is an illusion of consent in this deal where the idea that Hobbes comes up with is the origin of the social contract, but it isn't the rosy, cheery kind of kumbaya social contract of John Locke. It's a covenant of fear because it's, hey.
Of Rousseau, yeah.
Well, John Locke also is a social contract theorist.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
His version of it is much more like predicated on, the individual and their own willing participation.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of property.
As opposed to what Hobbes is talking about, where it's like, you're scared, you band together, you say, this guy is going to protect us. Look, in exchange for protecting us, we'll kick up a certain share of what we farm every season or within certain cycles, and then you protect us. That's what we receive in exchange, but it's an unequal exchange.
Right, and this is where you get like the concept of the Leviathan within Hobbes, right? Because one of the things that he does Karatani points out about the Hobbesian social contract, it's not about like, an eye for an eye or like a dog eat dog world between like a series of individuals. Rather, the sovereign becomes an individual in need of the protection or the need of protection from others from these multiplicity of associations, whether it's like certain castes, certain feudal lords, the list goes on. This is what the sovereign leader is supposed to do, is provide protection and create a covenant to avoid the destruction of these people by these other forms of associations that wish to sort of rule or plunder hoard property, land, wealth, etc. The list goes on and on and on. I think the emphasis is this idea of man needing protection, right? That Hobbes kind of points out in his sort of like myth, anthropological myth, which honestly, in that sense, it's not even just about protection. I think the key thing is the granting one life, right? Is the main thing. Yeah. And so in some sense, he kind of like gives the master slave dialectic twist to the Hobbesian myth of the covenant and the sovereign leader.
Well, the master's
The Lord and
slave
bondsman.
dialectic comes in here because it isn't so easy for one group of people to just vanquish another, for one community to vanquish another. I mean, if you think about Sparta, the Spartans' entire society was organized around keeping their slave population, the Messian Helots, in check. So one of the reasons that they were so intensely disciplined in such a martially obsessed group of people is because there is an ever-present possibility of an uprising on the part of a subjugated class that wouldn't exemplify mode B. The idea of mode B is that if we plunder a certain community, we have to redistribute the wealth, but through taxation, we keep this cycle alive and maintain a kind of balance. And this is where world empires emerge. But the mode of production here has more to do with trade with other communities. So it's not just about maintaining the fabric of society anymore. It's about trade, but not necessarily trade for the sake of profit either. That is still considered very much verboten. It's considered unethical trade for profit. But this is where we get the emergence of the state in the Hobbesian sense, with this sovereign power, which even then, it's not necessarily always meant to represent the people, but it's still seen as a sort of entity that serves the interests of all of the classes, but also generates classes in creating a division of labor. This is the Asiatic mode. And in a sense, all world empires, before they succumb to mode C, are Asiatic in structure. They begin with, city-states, but then this is where Karatani draws on Wallerstein in invoking.
For those of you who don't know, Emanuel Wallerstein was a world system theorist. I think he's an English sociologist and historian and a Marxist.
Yeah, and he, breaks things down in terms of core, periphery, and semi-periphery. Karatani is going to do his own twist on that by talking about margin, submargin, and outside of margin. So again, like we were saying, this isn't linear. It's not like, tribal communities are just gobbled up by world empires. They disappear, and we get world empires, and we just have to wait for mode C of capitalism, commodity exchange to arrive. No, it's a bit more complicated than that. All of these different forms are existing side by side. So this is where I find an example of
especially when you look at Greek city-states.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Greek city-states are very different because of their attitude towards trade and the market. So this is where we get world money not from Greece. Don't get me wrong, I'm getting things twisted here. The idea of the money form and world money is quite complicated because what serves as money within the community, I think he says, I think Malinowski was talking about how the communities that he observed would use like cowrie shells as their form of currency or money that is within their community because there is a value attached to cowrie shells, but outside of that community, there would be no real value. There's no inherent value for other communities. So, for something to serve as world money, it would have to have some kind of use value, like sheep. Everyone can find a use value in sheep, but within the community, it could be a metallic form of money that is minted by the state, or it could be in a tribal community as something like cowrie shells, which is assigned value within that community. So with world empires, you get something like world economy. This is where it gets a little tricky, and I'm looking at my notes here. Hopefully that will clarify things for me. Because the whole idea is that, any commodity.
Was world money like this is like where it kind of like also bleeds into like Alfred Steinmetz, where like world money form kind of also entails like this idea of like abstraction, right? Real abstraction as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so to bring it back to ancient Greece, the Greek polis, they are able to basically, I don't know if it would be world money, but they have a currency which, I could be wrong about this, but if I'm remembering correctly, has a purchasing power outside of the individual polis. And this is because many of these Greek polis, they don't make a distinction between trade and the market. So trade is done with other communities, foreigners, communities who don't share your language. The word barbarian comes from the sound that Greeks came up with to describe what other people spoke. Bar, 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 that's what their language sounded like to the ears of Greeks. So it's like when you are trading with another community, which is distinct from your own, you're incurring a certain level of risk. And in these clan communities, he talks about silent trade, how people would literally place the object that they want to trade in a clearing somewhere and hide behind a bush. And the people they're trading with would also be hiding behind a bush. And they basically go through this whole charade of like, we aren't directly exchanging anything because it's not exactly gift giving, right? Or that kind of transaction would be subsequent to gift exchange. Commodity exchange on the basis of use value is a mode C.
but then also in the beginning of the text too, he differentiates the sort of commodity exchange in like with the Greek polis from our commodity exchange because in capitalism, because of the use of slaves, right? The slave society that was a dominant form, um, which is different from chattel slavery, right? Chattel slavery does have a relationship to capitalist expansion, um, especially in America, but like in the Atlantic slave trade. But like like the use of the slave to educate, right, in the household, right, that was important.
Right. Yeah, that is a necessary condition of, well, like Athenian democracy.
Right. I guess yeah, for more Athenian democracy and like all of Greek city states in general. Because you got some that were more egalitarian than Athens, and that's where you get like the this idea of the isonomia in Karatani, or he
Right, which is
traces like Socrates.
exception.
Yeah.
The whole thing about the money, to take it back to that, is it's like it's a pledge. That's where the word wage comes from. It has to do with a pledge. So how is it that a universal yardstick of value is able to emerge in a world of uh, core margin and submarginal communities? Well, it emerges imminently, and to take it back to Sohn-Rethel there, it's like a real abstraction. The state cannot guarantee the value of money, and this is true to today, and it's actually like not just an antiquarian interest here. It actually has a lot to do with the debates that are currently happening between modern monetary theorists and Marxists about what the state's role is in
Right. It's the labor theory of value and the monetary form, right? Is the two debates.
Right. It's labor theory of value versus what MMTers believe, which is that it's ultimately the state which can determine the value of currency, but they also seem to conflate money and currency. But ultimately, the state can reissue money to resolve crises. That's what the MMTers believe, and Marxists believe that no, prices, but more importantly, value arises imminently within the exchange process through competition in the private sector amongst corporations. The state, as Karatani is going to lay out here, plays a very important role as an active agent, of course, in the development of industrial capitalism. But that's not to say that the state has the final say on the way that gold, for instance, is valued, or the value of gold as the standard against which all uh, money is measured, really. So, with the emergence of these world empires, that's what happens. And what we get are, like we could call them proto-capitalists, the miser, people who hoard money. But the capitalist is, as Marx says, like a rational miser. And let's take it back to like credit and debt. You have user capital, which is predicated on interest, the generation of interest. And that would be, M dash M prime without the C. It's money begetting money begetting money. Now, in the ancient world and in the medieval world and to today, obviously, usury is considered, well, sinful or, more lightly unethical because the idea of trade for profit was considered unethical. Now, everyone's profiting. There's always a surplus being generated. It's not like capitalism brings about surplus. Surplus has always existed. It's that the pursuit of surplus via calculation is what's considered unethical. So even people like the Phoenicians, whose entire civilization is based on trade, reject the profit motives here because it's seen as destructive. It's seen as a violation of what was already at that point illusory, that, there's always this sense of wanting to return to mode A, reinstate mode A, or on the universal level, and this brings us to D, create a sort of egalitarian society based on what would be considered equal exchange. So even in a society that is completely unequal in the way that we're describing, there's at least the conceit of maintaining relations of equality in this sense.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of like the transition from like the monotheistic, specifically like Christianity with like the kingdom of heaven and this idea of like in the parable of the rich, like it's easier for the camel to go through the eye of the needle than the rich to get into heaven. This sort of like mindset that then transitions into like the Kantian, like cosmopolitan, like kingdom of ends, right? This is like this sort of, I think as Karatani points out, like mode D is like in the way that it functions in history. It's not like that. It's like a concrete existing mode, like in the way that there is a Baromean knot between A, B, and C, and how today C is the dominant form vis-a-vis capital, but that like D is this sort of like you could say like whole and structured, like this repetition of a demand, right? It's a political demand, right? It's not like like an existing like society. Rather, it's like this society of this want to be a society of free association, or to be a Marxist in the sense it's like this desire for communism, a classless, moneyless, stateless society. That like seems like I wouldn't say like it like it's necessarily synonymous, but it kind of is like coexistent with like the repetition of mode D, which as he defines is like the higher form of mode A, vis-a-vis communism and the kingdom of ends and Kant, when a crisis emerges, right? It's the political demand within crisis.
Well, right.
But would you say also that so you made a good point, like the surplus has always existed and the idea of surplus has existed even before capitalist accumulation. But would you say it's the advent and the function of crisis for capitalism that's kind of a new thing, right?
Right, because it's the idea that capitalism can only function through these business cycles, is boom and bust cycle, which doesn't aim at preventing crises, but thrives
Mhm.
off of crisis.
Exactly. He uses in Transcritique an analogy, if not a homology, that he says that capitalism thrives off crises in the way that the hysteric thrives off her conversion symptoms.
Yeah, exactly. To
Yeah.
make it a psychoanalytic.
Yeah, but the neurotic symptom doesn't mean it's like, oh, this is the end of their suffering because they've experienced like the worst illness ever. No, actually, the symptom is what keeps them going, just like in the way crisis is what keeps capitalism going. It's not, it's sort of like, because Ricardo thought um, that the crisis was the end, like indicative of the end of this type of system. But Marx is pointing out, no, like it actually thrives off of that.
The drive misses its goal but reaches its aim, or is it the other way around?
It misses the object, but it still achieves the aim,
Right.
right, of the satisfaction.
Yeah, and it seems that capitalism functions in that way because it's the rational calculation of surplus value for the sake of its reinvestment and the valorization of capital is what characterizes mode C. And that inevitably leads to crisis because of the organic composition of capital. You know, it's like constant capital and variable capital are necessary to see development or the generation of the surplus value, but they're also at odds with one another because relative surplus value, which has to do with constant capital, um, the investment in the machinery and technology necessary for labor time to be exploited will always incentivize the capitalist to cut down on the amount of their own capital invested into the wage labor, the reproduction of the wage labor. But then what happens is if you cut down on wage labor and you are producing things to be bought on the market by those same people who are producing them, then they won't have enough money to buy back the products of their own labor. So you also have to maintain your consumer.
Right. Well, isn't this where we get into like maybe not this specifically, but this is like what's interesting about capitalism, this idea of the reserve army of labor that the capitalists have in this mode of exchange / mode of production. Right. Where it's like now we don't just like have a reservoir of goods, we have a reservoir of like an army of labor.
Well, one of the contradictions here that Karatani points out that really made me think was he quotes Marx saying, the capitalist who employs wage laborers is specifically interested in ensuring that his own workers have as little capacity for exchange and buying as possible, so that he can keep their wages low and also maintain a workforce that is subjugated to him. But that same capitalist has a completely contrary interest in ensuring that the wage labor who doesn't work for him is a consumer that can purchase the goods that he produces. So there's a contradiction there, because it's like you don't want your own people to have much flexibility when it comes to their own power to like transcend the state of affairs and become quote unquote middle class, because that would hurt you. But you want everybody else to be able to purchase your goods. So there's a contradiction there. This is one of the contradictions of capitalism that leads to crises, and I think we're experiencing one right now because nobody can afford shit. So
Yeah. And given the fact that like Karatani has some like orientation around world systems, I'm tempted to ask like the two questions, like the problem of like, well, I don't know if he brings it up because I don't think I got as far as you did in the text. I'm more familiar like the way he characterizes it in his like early years with the trans critique versus how he elaborates it in this text, because I think this text came out way later than the trans critique. But the problem of slavery within labor, and we say labor aristocracy if he uses that term, slavery slash colonialism, but then also the imperialist problem, right? Does he address either of those within like these the mode of exchange see as a dominant form within nation state capital?
well, what I was reading today is he says that the strange enough, world empires don't lead to imperialism per se. It's the nation state that transforms other societies, for lack of a better term, into nation states.
Right. That is a good
imperialism
distinction.
The nation,
Yeah.
it pursues imperialism.
Right, and that's a good question, because whenever we talk about like the decolonial question or the national question, it's in terms of the fight against imperialism. This is where like the whole debate around like not only the national question but like socialism in one country becomes about, which has a lot of political and historical implications. But you see like people in the periphery asking this thing, is this possible to like centralize and nationalize while aiming at socialism within the fight of not only imperialism but also decolonizing, right?
Well, I think Karatani sees nationalism as a problem because it's an imagined community. Gets that from Benedict Anderson's famous text. And the issue with that is nation and state go hand in hand, because nation is kind of the veil of the state, which offers again like a kind of restitution of mode A. And the issue with like the like colonized peoples and the confrontation between the nation state, which is always seeking to expand the proletariat, which can't but always recruit more and more workers who are willing to work for lower wages into the International Reserve Army of Labor. The problem there is that without the dissolution of the state, there can't be socialism in one country, because he says that the nation is often thought of by different, or the state is often thought of by different Marxists from its interior, but the exterior of the state is its relations, its intercourse with other states and other nation states. So that's why there would have to be like a simultaneous world revolution to overthrow the state in the way
Yeah.
Marxists imagine.
Yeah. But this wouldn't be the permanent revolution of the Trotsky bros. You know,
No,
was
because
everything.
yeah, right. But that's because Karatani believes that the Trotsky bros believe that you can skip stages. I mean, that's
Yeah.
yeah, and so does
Right.
Lenin, right? Or
Yeah.
you can precipitate the development of certain stages, or kind of fast track capitalism is what I think he believed initially, and Karatani would uh, disagree, I think, with both Lenin and Trotsky on that one, and Mao for that matter, because these are all, they're wildly different, but I think they all have some version of a thesis where the stages can be skipped over.
Right. And I think this is also just a problem, like, because of like the historical juncture that they're in. Like I guess you could say, like, I mean, there's more to it than just this, but I think like the main thing is like the hyper industrialization, right?
Yeah,
And like militarization, as they were, socializing, right? Which in a sense seems to give rise to this idea that, yeah, you could skip stages, if we could call it stages.
yeah. I have to take this badly. I'll be right back.
Let's take an intermission.
Yeah, I'm looking at my notes here, and another thing I wanted to talk about, take it back to what is distinctive about ancient Greece and Rome, and may, to a certain degree, serve as an explanation for their enduring influence. Well, first of all, it's interesting. This is a side note, but if we think about margin, submargin, out of margin, it's like, or out of sphere, it is margin, submargin, then core. If cores are world empires, what was Greece's main claim to fame here? It's that, during the Persian War, they defeated a world empire, an Asiatic despotic empire. And all of the different forms of government that Plato and Aristotle talk about, but especially Aristotle, with tyranny, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, oligarchy, it's like tyranny is considered the worst form. Now, there were tyrants throughout Greece. Tyrannos is a Greek word. The idea of any form of government, in the famous words of Churchill, the least bad, the least worst, all of them are the least worst compared to tyranny. And I think it's like tyranny is associated with Asiatic despotism. And in Athens is where you have the idea of the leader, be it Pericles or Demosthenes or any one of these. Well, later was the demagogues. It's funny because even Pericles' title, I think, was the Strategos during the Persian War, but the title doesn't even matter so much. It's a leader still conforms to a kind of, in a very different form, clan chiefdom idea of a leader who is, and now I'm talking about Augustus, like first among equals. So the pride that the Greeks had, and the Athenians first and foremost, in resisting the conquering drive of the Persian Empire was also ideological in the sense that they, as a submarginal culture, did not submit to world empire, did not allow themselves to be absorbed in world empire. Now, it's really the division of labor in Athens that permits this attitude, which allows for this sort of, what would I call it, almost like pride of like an underdog in a sense. And one thing Karatani says here is very interesting. He says that the reason that many of the polis, not just Athens, in Greece, are able to sustain themselves is that they don't make a distinction between market and trade. So the idea of trade here, I'm looking at my notes, it's like Karatani's big on, capitalism itself thriving on not just commodity exchange between communities, but the differences between value systems. Right? I think this is really interesting. The differences between value systems, and that's what is ultimately exploited. And that even the value system that is represented by wage labor and then the value system of the capitalist is one of these differences that generates surplus value. We're not there yet. We're not at surplus value, but trade and the market are the same in Greece and Rome in the sense that, well, silver and gold are adopted as external money and local money that's exchangeable across polis and exchangeable within the polis. There's a single price setting system, and that precludes the centralization of a bureaucratic structure that regulates prices. And what that creates in Athens is a division of labor. Athens, he says, develops democracy to actually preserve the ruling class. And that means that their citizens don't have to devote themselves to productive labor. They're engaged in military and political matters. What did Plato and Aristotle hate the most about democracy? It's the will of the majority, right? To
Majority, yeah.
tyranny
Yeah.
of the majority. He thinks that's very questionable.
Yeah.
Inane
Yeah.
for warrior
Yeah, that's okay.
farmers because they see themselves in terms of clan community. But what's the missing link here? Slavery. That's their motive. What enables this mode of production. So I just thought that was a really interesting take,
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's funny, like, that you mentioned that because, like, I've been listening to Varn's series on Plato and politics, and he kind of like theorizes like the Republic off of like what would a society be like where someone like Socrates could exist, because it's like the majority rule that Socrates was charged for corrupting the youth, but it wasn't like the youth of like oh, he's just going up to random little kids and he's just like telling them to question everything, including like their conception of the gods. He's like, no, he's actually associated with like the young Alcibiades. I think one of like Plato's cousins, Charminides, and a couple others who are participating in the military, who have some relationship in Athenian politics, and at some point like plot to overthrow the Athenian state. So like I also feel like that's kind of like a really interesting sort of supplement to like understand like Plato's sentiment towards Athenian democracy. Maybe not Aristotle per se, although Aristotle did have a relationship to Alexander the Great, he's his mentor. um, but it's interesting thinking like, that sort of historical aspect. And even when like he constructs like the Republic, it's like the idea of like kind of like slavery kind of like gets like thrown out the window, right? But it's like, did Plato have a conception of slavery besides just like, the slave of the passions?
Well, we know Aristotle was in favor of it. He saw it as part of
Yeah.
natural order. But
Yeah.
that's a good question. I have to watch
Mhm.
those episodes because I'm really interested in how the Republic would fit in to these different modes. And I don't know that Plato is necessarily arguing for a mode D exactly.
No, and
Democracy.
yeah, I mean that's what Plato in politics is very ambiguous because like Plato's Republic is one where and I always thought this for a while from Plato scholars that I'm familiar with, but like Varn points this out that like on a side note, Plato can't be read literally, specifically within the lines of the Republic because it's taken as like an analogy. So it's like an analogy for the soul, but it's like how much of that does lead to sort of like politics that leads to like someone legitly ruling over others that has more of a sort of aristocratic consciousness compared to others, the philosopher king as their aristocratic leader.
Yeah, I wonder if it's actually aristocracy that he craves because it's not just rule by the majority in terms of electing political officials that Plato seems to oppose, but also this market economy, where it's the market economy itself is ruled by the will of the masses, and I think that is seen as the rule of the ignorant over the wise, essentially, because the summation of the whims of the citizens of Athens could only be the apogee of ignorance in a sense. And I wonder actually that could play into this idea of the prophet. Now, I wonder if in a sense Plato's philosopher king is something like a prophet. Karatani says
Right.
there is no real distinction between philosopher and prophet, whether we're talking about Confucius and the 100 schools of thought or Socrates. The prophet and the philosopher, they are someone who who, who comes along and dismantles the state religion, basically. Socrates is almost Christ-like in that sense. It's like where Jesus attacks the Pharisees, Socrates attacks the prevailing order, which we could call, in a sense, maybe it's a stretch ideology, the ideology
The
of
orthodoxa, yeah.
the orthodox, exactly. And we were talking about like the pantheon of gods, and the Roman Empire is a good example of this, where it's like they pursued a policy of syncretism, right? Where it's like you can worship your gods. Your god is just another name for
For
Jupiter.
Jupiter, yeah.
Same guy, but they
Yeah,
also it's a weird.
Roman paganism was very syncretist. That's usually, but then also that it makes their religion with political life interesting because then even the emperor takes on the status of deity, right?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, and I recommended I Claudius to you, and in I
Oh
Claudius,
yeah,
it's fictionalized, but Augustus has certain reservations about being deified. There's a part in the series where he's told like, hey, they're erecting a temple to you in Parthia, I think, or so somewhere like it was at modern day Iran, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And he's like, I don't know how I feel about that. I know that Alexander was cool with deification, but this is a slippery slope because Augustus still sees himself as like restoring the Republic. And the whole idea of I Claudius is that Claudius, who is an unlikely emperor, no one would imagine that he would ever become emperor as a staunch Republican. He wants to restore the republic. That's his dream. They fear what? Tyranny. Tyranny is seen as a signal evil that could infect a community. And I think it has actually something to do with this illusion of still existing within a kind of mode A. And not, it's strangely enough straddling the fence between A and B, where it's like, we're not a world empire. We're not an Asiatic despotic system.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of, yeah, I'm thinking I'm going off of like, not necessarily off topic, but off of like, the Roman history, because like this idea of the Republic is quite interesting, especially how you situated him, like, kind of wanting to go back to mode A, because like, we see a lot of our contemporary comrades who we distance ourselves and, staunchly disagree with, try to align, Marx, along the path of liberalism, which I think is wrong in a sense, and this is where like, I've had discussions with, our friend of the show, Daniel Tut, in our study groups, that there's a relationship between Marx and the idea of the Republic, right? And especially like if mode D is communism, right? The spirit of communism, or the kingdom of ends, it's mode D sublated to a higher form. What would that look like if not something like a republic, but with like a different frame, right? Where there's free association versus like, a form of, state control, right? But my point is that like this idea of the republic is quite different from like the sort of liberalism that has a different tradition. It has nothing to do with, the relationship of Marx, Engels, and the Jacobin tradition, which I believe has a strong relationship to the republic versus liberalism.
I'd never thought about that, so I can't really comment on that. But that's interesting. I just want to talk about, before we wrap up this first episode, because I think we're gonna have to do part 2, because there's just so much here. Just universal religions. It's so dense. It's denser than a good brownie. It's thick.
Cheesecake.
So like the idea of a universal religion is this unknown X of mode D.
Right.
It cannot exist. It's an ideal form. Here we get Max Weber, and he talks about this development of religion from magic, the transition from the magician to the priestly class. There's this Latin phrase, do ut des, I give so that you may give. This is mode A, reciprocity. Reciprocal exchange creates debt. And magic in mode A enforces egalitarianism. But in mode B, magic enforces a relation of subordination and protection. This is where it gets tricky. Now there's a bilateral relation between God and man. You're asking for something in return. In mode A, you aren't asking God for something in the sense of, please let me get good rainfall for my crops. This year I'll bring you the best goat I have. Come on, help me out here. Mode A doesn't work that way, because it's not God's our nature. Nature is the gods. It's not, I think, is anthropomorphic. And even when it seems anthropomorphic, it's not in the way of, for instance, a Roman Sumerian religion, Egyptian religion. So there's a bilateral relationship. There's a king priest who is, I guess, the vicar of God, if not deified himself. And religion becomes, Karatani uses Althusser's famous term, an ideological state apparatus centralized. So we go from magic to religion. We go from clan society to the state. It's the god and the king, if they aren't one and the same, who are delivering rain, who are creating the conditions for a good harvest. But here's the thing that's very interesting. You would think, oh, we cower in the aspect of God. We're completely subservient to him. No, the gods are often discarded. It's kind of like, you don't want to do anything for me, then you're out of the picture. Screw you. They're always discarded. It's like, let's find the best gods. Let's find the gods that are going to help us out. This god's not doing anything for us. He's out of the picture. The truly transcendent God, this is a really interesting point he makes. The truly transcendent God doesn't make an appearance until it's a God who cannot be abandoned, right? So the God of the monarchy of a certain state is the same level as the gods in the conquered tribe. No one's like, my God's better than yours necessarily. It's like, my God is just more successful. My God just favors me more than you, my community more than yours. But with the negation of world empire, you bring about a transcendent God of a universal religion. We were talking about Akhenaten before. That's he who serves Aten, the sun god. Monotheism is contemporaneous with the rise of empire, obviously.
Yeah.
The Jew
And then like before, like, yeah, that, because it's not technically monotheistic, but like Zoroastrianism is like one where, like, there is this relationship between a sort of universal religion and the political apparatus or like state. Zoroaster is that priest that kind of puts religion and the idea of like stasis and harmony with what's his name, is it Ahura Mazda, right? As like, the god of light, harmony, and stability in political life versus like the god of disruption and change, which is Ormazd, right? Or Angramenyu, right? This is why, like, lying is like wrong, no political lying or anything like that. But like, this is like the sort of like preconditions for then like something like Atenism or like Akhenatenism to then like Moses and monotheism.
Right. And the prophet. And
prophet, yes.
Karatani calls the ethical prophet. And here's where money comes in. This is very interesting. Look at my notes here. It says, basically, world money gives birth to universal religions as mode of exchange D. And that's because world money becomes universal. And that actually doesn't depend on the internal affairs of the world empire, but exchange between empires and communities. The state can only guarantee the coinage and metallic content of the money, but not its value. That is determined by commodity exchange itself. It's commodity exchange, which is considered, a force of disintegration within these communities. And this is a really interesting point. Money replaces magic as a means of coercion. So that he relates this to Weber's idea of disenchantment. So what does Jesus, when he gets to the temple, direct his ire towards? It's the moneylenders, the people selling outside of the temple. He's like, taking a bat to them,
Yeah.
That it's the one time you see it's like his actual rage comes through. The prophet makes an appearance here, and it could be Jesus or Muhammad. There's ethical prophet and exemplary prophet. Exemplary prophet is like a Buddha, Confucius, Lao Tzu. So in Asian religions, more prominent in the West, or Islam's not really the West, but Jesus and Muhammad are like ethical. Exemplary prophet leads by example. That's an aside, but the philosophers of Ionia are prophets, he says. Socrates is like a prophet. Um, the thinkers of the 100 schools of thought are prophets. Sophists, yeah. Zoroaster. Then we have Judaism. The thing about the Jews here is that there's no real reciprocity between God and the people. There's no concept of God or any notable differences between Israel and the other tribal confederacies in the area. But under the fall, under Babylonian, the fall of the southern Jewish king, the state falls, but it's very counterintuitive to how other communities would tend to react to it being vanquished. They didn't abandon their God.
Yeah.
On the contrary, their faith is intensified by their subjugation. And a new concept of God is born here. So this means the defeat of the state no longer means the defeat of its God. God's what the Jews interpret in the wake of their downfall as God's will is a kind of punishment, a rejection of reciprocity. So the prophet is the person who comes along to preach a kind of mode, right, of reciprocal exchange. But I think with the Jews, with a God that cannot fail, right? Although I'm like tying myself in knots here because that's not exactly reciprocal. But here's where it gets interesting. Universal love. What is universal love? It's an unreciprocal.
I was just about to say that when you get into Christianity, you get into this idea of the God of love, right, versus the God of Moses who commands, right, and only speaks to the prophets. Of course, Jesus is, when you get into Christianity, it's more theologically sophisticated. Not that Judaism, it's just like there's more complexities. But yeah, the God of love brings out a different relationship between God and man, right, where there's likeness, right, and an analogy and participation, which I don't think you really see in the Jewish tradition and even in their mysticism, right?
Well, it's unrepresentable, right? It's more iconoclastic in that sense, and Judaism has this in common with Islam, right? You can't really represent.
Yeah.
And there's a contradiction between universality and particularity here, but I think it's like the gratuity, at least in Christianity, now we're talking about Christianity, but of God's love is something that you as a lowly human could never hope to reciprocate. You don't have anything that God could possibly want. This is life. The gift of life is something that can never be reciprocated. Now, this mode D, of course, what happens to it? Well, it's reabsorbed into mode B of the state religion of a world empire, and then we get cycles of prophet-like figures who come about. Let's fast forward centuries and get a Luther, right, who attacks the Catholic Church, talks about a personal relationship with God. Let's jettison this bureaucracy. Let's get rid of this parasitic caste of priests and this bloated, sprawling institution, which has nothing to do with God's command.
What's interesting about Karatani's thoughts on Weber and religion, because Weber's famous for capitalism and the spirit of the Protestant work ethic, as if that's in his genealogy, the ethic of capitalism and this working hard and saving, right, for later rather than splurging all at once, comes from the Protestant work ethic. But Karatani shows that existed way before even Protestantism, that you see in certain modes, I think maybe even in the Asiatic modes of production, that the relationship between religion and economic and social life were maintained because of a certain style of work ethic from the religions that predominated. And I think this goes back to I think what's different is I think how you pointed out, in the advent of the money form, we transitioned from a society of magic and animism to then money, coercion, and religion, right? And religion as a sort of ideological state apparatus, to use the Althusserian term.
Yeah, because coercion is necessary at this point, and people are also, bureaucrats are receiving wage.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And in terms of the Catholic Church, they were also the priestly caste were also the scholars. They were the ones doing the hermeneutics of the Bible. And then with Luther, then in Protestantism, everybody gets a Bible, right? So then there's this sort of personalization with the conception of God.
Which is funny though, because Luther also hated peasants. He was for the genocide of peasants at the same time, which is kind of it's contradictory, right? Because it's let's have a literate class of people who can tend to their interior lives and form a personal bond with God that would bypass the institution, at least of the Catholic Church, but also we should burn these peasants alive.
Yeah.
It's not exactly of the lower depths.
Nah, he's definitely a proto-bourgeois class, if anything.
But wow, there's so much to talk about. I know you've got your cartel meeting coming up. This dude, he can go back to back with these intense discussions. I could never go to a cartel.
Yeah, and he's just opening up so many debates, not only within Marxism but within impasses of history and the rise of religion, the rise of money. The dude's using the Baromean knot to knot different impasses of debates.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I like these thinkers.
In a sense, he could do what Zizek wishes he could do by being eclectic, bringing all these things, and he's not too fast. He's very precise about it.
Zizek at his best can set in relief certain points of tension that would be difficult to articulate otherwise, but we have yet to see if he'll ever come out with something a bit more schematic. This is a schematic to an extreme. I'm sure someone like Barn would probably have a lot of issues with Karatani's argument here at different points, but it's still, the sweep of it is extremely impressive. And it's I think in order to frame these debates properly, you have to kind of, to use a Deleuzean term, reterritorialize the terms of agreement or disagreement in a way where it's you basically have to rephrase everything in order to understand what's at stake here instead of just polemics, right? Because this isn't a polemical text. It's not polemics.
No, he's really rigorous, and he's like taking a lot of serious but unfleshed out debates and really trying to bring out the core argument and the core problems when we look at like how do certain societies arise, how do we transition from this and that, and what is like the certain contradictions that arise, and what is actually preserved even in the newer form of social metabolism.
Yeah, and it's I don't know, it's a lot to contend with. I think Karatani is definitely someone that you have to grapple with. It's funny how in the introduction it's like, I'm like, I've never tried to be systematic. I'm actually not that good at like system building. It's like, are you kidding me? Like, what are you talking about? I think this is a pretty tight system you've come up with, and I don't know if Leclau ever, shouts at Karatani again, we're gonna have words.
Well, Leclau is dead, so
Yeah, no, he's dead.
yeah.
That's pretty important.
Yeah. I don't think Karatani wants to create a sedentary life wherever he's buried, so he don't need that resentment.
He got like $1 million reward for something I read on Wikipedia.
Karatani, he also got I thought he got the Nobel Peace Prize as well. He turned down the reward, but I think he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize.
They awarded him like $1 million for this, so that's maybe we could get, I don't know, $10,000 for this conversation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, you probably gotta go.
Yeah. Let's do this again, though, for sure.
All right, yeah, because we got more to talk about. We haven't even gotten into like Mauss and Marx, so I think this could be two-parter.
Yeah. Well, two-part for sure.
All right.
Y'all. Peace out.
Peace.